The storm has passed, but the air still trembles with its memory. The forest that surrounds the lake is silent, heavy, as if even the trees know what lies in the water. The moon hides behind drifting clouds, and in its absence the surface is black glass, broken only by the faint shimmer of ripples spreading outward from something lying just beneath. The smell of wet earth clings to your breath, thick with the tang of iron. Then the shapes emerge. Two bodies, still, pale, unnaturally quiet. One lies twisted in the reeds, his skin marked by scratches, his neck carrying the dark imprint of strangling hands. The other drifts closer to shore, his limbs slack, his fine clothes heavy with water. A timepiece clings to his wrist, its ticking heart long extinguished, the hands frozen just before 7. His lungs hold no water. The shallow depths that cradle him are too low, too still, to have claimed his life. And yet he is dead. This man was not only flesh and bone. He was a king. The silence presses harder. The lake laps gently against their bodies, as if trying to rock them back to life. The wind moves through the reeds with a hiss that sounds too much like voices. Somewhere in that darkness, you hear the phantom echo of a gunshot, sharp and final, carried in memory across the stillness of the shore. A fisherman stands nearby, his gaze averted, his silence already purchased. His life will soon be changed by coin, his story erased from the records. But whispers will live longer than him. Whispers that the king had not simply fallen into the lake, but had been running, reaching for escape, when death struck him down. What you are witnessing is not an accident, nor the madness of a broken mind. It is theater, a stage set upon shallow waters, crafted to look like tragedy, but smelling only of conspiracy. And yet, this night is not the beginning. This ending was written years before. It began with a single image, a photograph that should never have existed. It began with a single image, a portrait taken in the spring of 1881, when the king, traveling under an assumed name, allowed a photographer to capture what should never have been seen. In the frame sits a young actor, barely 23, his hand resting on his knee, his body relaxed in the ornate chair reserved for nobility. And beside him, standing, is the king of Bavaria, a sovereign reduced to the posture of a servant, while a commoner holds the place of honor. In the rigid world of royal protocol, where position was more than ceremony and posture more than pride, this was unthinkable. A king never stood while another sat, not even before his own family. To stand was to acknowledge subordination. To allow another man to sit in his presence was to shatter the unspoken hierarchy that had sustained monarchies for centuries. But what was most dangerous was not the chair, nor the standing. It was the eyes. The actor stares at the camera, unflinching, a faint smile tugging at his lips, as though he knows the power of the moment. The king does not look at the lens. His gaze is fixed instead on the man beside him, steady, unguarded, filled with something that no courtier, no minister, no subject was ever meant to witness. It is not the look of a sovereign. It is not the mask of command. It is the gaze of a man entirely, helplessly, in love. When copies of this photograph reached Munich, the reaction was immediate. The ministers, already burdened with whispers of the king's nocturnal habits and his debts that threatened to swallow the treasury, understood at once what the image revealed. For 2 decades they had managed to hide rumors, to smother gossip with dismissals and bribes. But this was not rumor. It was evidence. The truth, captured on paper, unable to be denied. What the photograph showed was not simply affection. It showed betrayal of the image a monarchy was built upon. Bavaria could tolerate eccentricity, could forgive extravagance, but it could not forgive a sovereign whose eyes revealed what his lips would never dare say aloud. The photograph spread in whispers, in private collections, in the locked drawers of men who understood its meaning. Ministers studied it like a weapon, knowing it could be sharpened into something lethal. This was not merely scandal. This was proof that the king's world, his hidden world of secrecy and shadows, had slipped into the open. And once a secret escapes into light, it cannot be contained again. That single image became the pivot on which the king's fate would turn. It was the breach through which his enemies would march. From that moment they no longer needed to speculate. They had seen with their own eyes what he felt, what he desired, what he had built his castles to conceal. This was the beginning of the end. If you want more stories power tried to bury, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Long before the photograph, there was a boy who would be king, and a love that taught him that desire was dangerous. Munich, 1863. The court shimmered with gold, its halls echoing with music and ceremony. Yet for the 18-year-old crown prince, it was not the brilliance of chandeliers that captured him, but the eyes of another. Prince Paul von Thurn-Uendi-Taxis entered his life wearing the uniform of an aide-de-camp. Polished buttons gleaming, posture perfect, his presence undeniable. Their meetings began formally, but soon, as the nights lengthened, the prince would slip quietly into Ludwig's chambers after the court had retired. Letters survive, fragments of devotion that escaped the fire meant to consume them. "My heart beats only for you," Paul wrote, his words trembling on the edge of confession. Ludwig replied with passion so unguarded it could never be spoken aloud. "You are the sun in my darkness. Without you, I pace my chambers like a caged animal. But the walls of palaces hear everything, and whispers have their own gravity." Servants spoke. Ministers noted. His mother summoned Paul, and by dawn he was gone, exiled to Prussia, never to return. Ludwig learned then that love would always mean loss. And yet he could not unlearn what those nights had taught him, that in the dark hours, when society slept, he could live as himself. By the time the crown touched his head at 18, that lesson had already begun to shape him. With the weight of kingship came expectations he could never meet. He was told to marry, to produce heirs, to secure a dynasty 7 centuries old. Princess Sophie, sister of the Empress Elisabeth, was chosen. She was intelligent, graceful, the perfect queen in every sense but one. Ludwig postponed the wedding again and again until finally he broke it himself. "I cannot do this to you," he told her. "You deserve a husband who can love you completely. I am not that man." She never married another, yet she carried with her a wound that was not love, but refusal. It was then that Ludwig began to build. Neuschwanstein rose against the Bavarian cliffs not as a fortress of power, but as a fortress of privacy. Its spires reached skyward, but its foundations were hollowed with hidden corridors, secret stairways, concealed doors that allowed servants to vanish without being seen. The throne room glittered with mosaics of angels and kings, yet the throne itself was never installed. It was never meant to host a court. It was meant to host his secrets. And so the castles multiplied. Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, each more fantastical than the last. Historians would later call them monuments to madness, but they were not. They were monuments to longing. Every stone, every fresco, every gilded chamber was designed to hold a truth too dangerous to live in daylight. By the 1870s, Ludwig had reversed the rhythm of his life completely. He slept through the sunlit hours, rising only as darkness fell. Ministers waited in vain through empty mornings. Councils were summoned at midnight. He dined at 3, held conversations at 4, retired at dawn. He had become, in every sense, the king of night. And in that night he created his kingdom. The Venus Grotto at Linderhof, an artificial cavern with a heated underground lake, became his stage. Electric lights, the first of their kind in Germany, bathed the cave in shifting colors. Crimson for passion, blue for sorrow, green for envy. Hidden musicians played Wagner from behind false rock walls while Ludwig floated in a golden shell-shaped boat across the water, accompanied by the companion of his choosing. Servants worked these nights for extraordinary wages, sworn into silence, though silence is never absolute. Some spoke of dances. Young men adorned with garlands of flowers, commanded to move before the king in scenes that blurred theater and desire. This was not madness. This was a man carving out a space in the only hours where he could exist unmasked. His castles were not fairy tales. They were sanctuaries, not the dreams of a mad king, but the survival of a lonely one. Most only see fairy tale towers. Subscribe if you want the truth behind them. The whispers began as murmurs in the corridors of his palaces. Servants who had once been trusted confidants, rewarded for their silence, sometimes proved too weak for the burden of secrets. A few were dismissed quietly, their wages cut off, their pride wounded. And wounded men talk. They described midnight gatherings where young actors were summoned from Munich's theaters, commanded to perform not on stage but in the seclusion of the king's chambers. They spoke of music drifting from the grotto at unholy hours, of dances that blurred the line between ritual and desire, of bodies crowned not with medals but with flowers. At first, these reports lived only in private letters, exchanged between ministers who half believed, half feared them. But one man knew how to weaponize whispers. Count Maximilian von Hohenstein, once Ludwig's ally, now his rival, began to collect them with the patience of a spider. He bribed servants for their testimonies. He bribed a valet for stolen pages from Ludwig's diary, passages where the king confessed his torment, prayers for forgiveness scrawled beside words of passion for the men who had filled his nights. Each entry was twisted into proof of decline, each confession reshaped into evidence of moral decay. Hohenstein gathered receipts for jewels and estates gifted to companions. He amassed letters filled with endearments that could never have been meant for a public eye. He did not need to invent madness. He only needed to frame longing as disease. With each document, each account, each stolen word, the scaffolding of a case was being built. A case not against the king's rule, but against his very humanity. Still, whispers could be denied. A diary could be called forgery. Testimonies could be dismissed as vengeance from bitter servants. What Hohenstein needed was something irrefutable, something that spoke louder than rumor. That moment came in 1881, in Lucerne, Switzerland. The king had traveled under an alias, hoping for anonymity. At his side was the actor Joseph Keynes, the newest star in Ludwig's secret world. He was ambitious, handsome, and intoxicating in a way that the king found irresistible. They traveled as master and secretary, but it was a fragile disguise. In a moment of indulgence, Ludwig allowed a photographer to capture their likeness together. The image was a catastrophe. Keynes sat at ease in a chair of ornament and honor, his expression calm, almost smug, as though aware of the danger it carried. Beside him, standing, was the king himself, a monarch reduced to the posture of a servant. And worst of all, Ludwig's eyes betrayed him. He was not looking at the camera. His gaze was fixed on the actor, filled with a tenderness that protocol could not excuse and politics could not forgive. When copies of that photograph reached Munich, ministers did not need explanation. They had in their hands what none of them dared to name aloud. No rumor, no stolen diary, no vengeful testimony could compare to this. The king himself, caught in an unguarded moment, his affection laid bare for eternity. The photograph was never meant to exist. But once taken, it could not be destroyed. Passed from hand to hand, studied not as art but as evidence. It was a portrait of a sovereign undone not by enemies on the battlefield, but by his own desire made visible. From that moment the whispers hardened into weapons. And every minister, every noble who held a copy, knew they were holding the king's undoing. Would you risk a crown for love? Comment below, and subscribe for more forbidden histories. The photograph was enough to wound him, but his enemies wanted more than scandal. They needed a blade sharp enough to cut him from the throne itself. And so they turned to medicine not for healing but for judgment. Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, Bavaria's most celebrated psychiatrist, was summoned. He had never spoken to the king, never looked into his eyes, never listened to his voice. But that did not matter. What mattered was that he was willing. From scraps of rumor, from whispers of servants, from the diaries stolen and twisted, he wove a report that clothed suspicion in the garb of science. Every eccentricity was recast as a symptom, his nocturnal life proof of dementia, his castles evidence of delusions of grandeur, his devotion to Wagner's music and the grotto lit in changing colors, hallmarks of a disordered mind. His letters to men, filled with longing, diagnosed as moral insanity. On parchment, desire became illness, grief became madness, love became corruption. It was not medicine. It was betrayal written in the language of authority. In June 1886, the verdict was delivered. The king was declared insane and unfit to rule. His uncle, Prince Luitpold, was appointed regent. Ministers who once bowed before Ludwig now turned their allegiance without hesitation. For the power of a crown is never loyal to the man who wears it, only to the survival of those who guard it. Word of the decision reached Neuschwanstein before the commission arrived. Servants, terrified yet loyal, whispered to him that escape was possible. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, his cousin and perhaps the only one who understood him, had arranged for carriages at the border. But Ludwig stood unmoving in his chamber. Where would a deposed king go? He asked quietly. The words fell heavy, like a sentence passed upon himself. Without the crown, without the illusion of sovereignty, what remained? A man stripped of both power and sanctuary, too well known to disappear, too dangerous to live openly, too hunted to survive in exile. At 4 in the morning on June 12th, the commission arrived. They found him already dressed, as though he had been waiting. For the first time, von Gudden stood before the man he had condemned without ever meeting. How can you call me insane? Ludwig asked, his voice steady. When you have never examined me. The doctor's answer was cold and final. It is unnecessary. The evidence is overwhelming. They led him away from his fortress of stone and into confinement at Berg Castle, a place called treatment, but in truth, a prison. The king of Bavaria, once lord of castles that seemed born from dreams, was reduced to a captive of his own ministers. Do you think that was courage or surrender? Let me know in the comments. Even in captivity, there was a strange calm about him. At Berg Castle, on the edge of Lake Starnberg, Ludwig seemed resigned, yet not broken. Guards were posted at every door. Von Gudden remained close, his physician's role now blended with the cold precision of a jailer. For less than 2 days, the king lived under this watchful silence. Then came the evening of June 13, 1886, a night that would erase him from the living world and cast him forever into the realm of mystery. The rain had passed, but the ground was still slick, the air thick with the damp weight of summer storms. At around 6:30, Ludwig requested a walk along the lake. Von Gudden agreed. Some say it was pity, others call it overconfidence, but the doctor dismissed the guards, declaring, "The king is calm. We need no protection from a broken man." The two walked down the gravel path together, their silhouettes swallowed by trees. It was the last time they would be seen alive. When they did not return, hours passed in uneasy waiting. At last, searchers fanned out with lanterns cutting through the night. Just beyond the reeds, in water scarcely to the waist, they found what should have been impossible. 2 bodies. Von Gudden's corpse bore the unmistakable violence of struggle. His face raked by deep scratches, his neck bruised with the marks of strangling hands. His watch had stopped at 10 minutes past 8. A few meters away floated the king. His body lay face down, but when turned, his chest revealed no trace of water in the lungs. He had not drowned. His watch, strangely, had stopped much earlier at 6:54, as though time itself had split between them. Witnesses swore Ludwig had been a strong swimmer. He had crossed lakes before without effort. Yet here he lay in water too shallow to claim him, a sovereign extinguished in the reeds like a common drunk fallen from shore. Rumors clung to his coat, a garment that vanished after the autopsy, never seen again. Some whispered of 2 bullet holes torn into the fabric. One noblewoman swore she glimpsed them before the coat disappeared forever, as though someone had ensured that no trace of gunfire would survive official record. And then there was the fisherman. Jacob Little, the man who had pulled their bodies from the water, remained curiously silent about what he had seen that night. Within months, he was wealthy enough to purchase property. Within a year, he had risen to mayor of his town. In private papers discovered long after his death, he confessed to what he dared not say aloud, that Ludwig had been fleeing, moving toward a boat he had prepared for escape. And then a shot. The king fell forward into the lake. The fisherman wrote, "I was told, if I valued my family's lives, I had seen nothing but 2 drowned men. The official report declared it murder-suicide. That Ludwig had strangled his doctor, then turned upon himself. But nothing in the scene obeyed that verdict. The bruises on Gudden's neck suggested resistance. Yes, but Ludwig's empty lungs told another story. The shallow water refused the narrative of drowning. The missing coat whispered of bullets and silenced witnesses. What happened on the banks of Lake Starnberg remains a theater of shadows. A king imprisoned for his secrets, a doctor caught in his orbit, a fisherman paid to hold his tongue. And in the silence that followed, a monarchy secured its safety by burying its sovereign in mud and myth. Do you believe the king truly drowned? Or was he silenced? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe to Cursed Chronicles for more untold histories. By morning, the story was already written. The official verdict came swift and final: murder-suicide. The king had strangled his doctor in a fit of madness, then drowned himself in shallow water. The case was closed before questions could even be asked. The coat disappeared, the testimonies of guards went silent, and the fisherman who had pulled the bodies ashore found wealth and power waiting for him like payment for obedience. What could not be hidden was destroyed. His private papers were seized, many burned before they could ever be studied. The servants who had lived within his night kingdom were dismissed, sent away with generous pensions bound by silence. Entire chambers of memory were erased as if a man's life could be tidied away with ink and coin. Yet erasure is never complete. Whispers linger where fire cannot reach. Some remembered the mark of bullets. Others recalled the sudden prosperity of those who had seen too much. And always, in the corridors of Europe, there remained one voice unafraid to speak. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, his cousin and confidant, wrote in her diary, "They killed him not because he was insane, but because he was free." In those words lies the truth that official records could never admit, that Ludwig's crime was not madness but defiance, the refusal to live a life that was not his own. Irony is cruel, and in his death it was merciless. The castles he was condemned for building, monuments scorned as follies of a delusional mind, became Bavaria's greatest treasure. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, each a fortress once ridiculed, now thrown open to the world. Tourists filed through the halls he had crafted for secrecy, walking past frescoes painted to shelter his dreams, gazing at towers he had raised to protect a heart forbidden to beat openly. The state that branded him insane found profit in his passion. Today, Neuschwanstein alone yields millions every year. Its silhouette stamped on postcards, coins, and the fantasies of millions who will never know the man behind the stone. In death, Ludwig achieved what he could not in life. He became immortal, not as a ruler of armies, not as a voice in parliaments, but as the architect of impossible beauty. His castles, once called madness, are now fairy tales made flesh. But within their walls lingers the ghost of their true purpose. Not wonder, but concealment. Every tower hides a secret. Every chamber remembers the weight of silence. At Lake Starnberg, the waters remain still. On fog-draped nights, some claim to see lights glimmering where he fell, soft and steady, like lanterns floating over the surface. They say it is Ludwig, still searching for the boat that never carried him to freedom, still trying to escape the prison of a crown that was also a cage. This was the forbidden photo that killed a king. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, where we uncover the truths history tried to silence.